they peak around April, May. I mean, it takes a while for the bulk of the harvest to get going.
Hi, once again, everybody. Welcome back to the CommStock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. Thanks for joining us today. And here we are on a short trading week. Yes, indeed. We're going to have Thursday off because of the Thanksgiving Day holiday. There will be no markets that day. Well, today, here on a Tuesday, I have the honor of bringing aboard Matthew Kruse, the president of CommStock Investments, and get his insight into what's going on in Brazil now that we're gearing up and getting deeper and deeper into their growing season. He has a lot of personal experience in Brazil. Matthew, thank you for joining us here today. So I guess first, off the top, do you want to take a look at the weather outlook, or where do you want to start today?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably what's most pressing is looking at the weather. You know, we're in that kind of critical period here now where market is increasingly looking at what's going on in South America. They're down to almost their last 10% for planted area for soybeans in Brazil. And so this is just a kind of an anomaly map of what is trending wetter and what is trending drier, at least through this period of December 5th. And so you kind of see we flip-flopped a little bit where last week we were trending a little bit drier. Now, as we kind of hinted that the rainfall is coming back, and this kind of supports that at least in the southern part of the country. You can kind of see that Rio Grande do Sul, especially on into Argentina, it's going to be extremely wet here in the next 10 days or so. You know, a lot of the trade focuses on the center west region there, Mato Grosso, and so it's not quite is wet, but some of these red areas, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily like widespread drought. It just means for this period of time that it's getting below average rainfall. And so I don't, for the major areas, I don't see any concern. I've maybe in the northern part of Mato Grosso, it's a little bit drier than average, but up until last week, people were telling me that it was almost raining too much. And so it could probably ease off the gas pedal a little bit. And so maybe the only trend is that it just seems like that northeast part of Brazil continues to lean drier. And so there's a little bit of a concern there, but it's not a huge area. And so it could be made up elsewhere. And so that's essentially what we're seeing right now, that overall there's no major issues. I think temperature wise, things are within their range. There isn't any place that's, overly oppressive right now. And so it's just kind of within the average temperature ranges.
So far, it doesn't seem like the growing season has had any major obstacles. I mean, it had a delayed start, but it seems like they caught up in pretty good shape.
Yeah, they were a little delayed starting out, but they've caught back up to they're above the 3-year average overall. Maybe Mato Grosso got a little bit later start, but so far there's no issues, but obviously there's a long ways to go yet in the season.
So if you have a delayed start like that, historically, does that mean much of a change in your yield at the end of the year?
Not much in the soybeans, or I should say it doesn't have to mean there's necessarily a yield lag in the soybeans. It's mostly reflective in the second crop corn that follows it, because they have a very wide or long growing season. And so it's fine for the first crop of soybeans. If it rains well later in the season, later planted soybeans can still make up for it. You don't have concern about frost or anything like that. It's just that your second crop of corn gets planted later, and that will more than likely run into some, a quick end to the dry season. And so if you're ideally, you'd like to plant it all in January or early February, that second crop corn, because the rainfall can start to shut off in April. Well, if you're planting it in late February or March and it shuts off in April, you just didn't get enough time to get much of a crop out of it.
Well, and that becomes more and more important of an issue, doesn't it? Because Brazil is starting to really crank out some ethanol production here these days, and they're just adding to that capacity as they go, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. Historically, Brazil has had some of the cheapest corn in the world, especially in that Mato Grosso area, that's where all that second crop corn is highly concentrated. And so you're continuing to see that increase kind of following the growth of the land expansion with soybeans. And rather than ship all that out, I think it's probably dawned on them finally that they can add value to that corn and process it and turn it into ethanol.
All right, if that's the case, you have a map here now. I don't read Portuguese. You may have to explain to our audience what we're looking at here. What is this reflecting on the map?
So this is just Itaú Bank put this map together that basically shows all of the current corn ethanol plants and then all of the projected ethanol plants. And basically they're showing what the growth is expected to take place. And so in kind of the blue there are the current ethanol plants, the full ethanol plants, I should say, that they're just using corn as their feedstock. Now in that kind of shade of green, those are also corn ethanol plants, but they're flex plants. And that means that half the year they're using sugarcane as their feedstock and the other half they're using the corn. And so, because traditionally a lot of these plants have been established for a long time, they just use sugarcane. They would run 6 months out of the year and then they would shut down. Well, now they're saying, well, now we can run year round by making some modifications to the plant. So they call those the flex plants. Now in the kind of the orange color are the projected plants that are expected to come online here in the next few years for more corn ethanol. The red ones, kind of more further in the south, are projected ethanol plants from wheat. And that's where most of the wheat is planted in Brazil and in the kind of the deep south there in Rio Grande do Sul. And so you kind of see that basically they're projecting some heavy investment in ethanol across Brazil. The numbers they throw out there that 6 billion additional liters. And so right now they're producing, I think we got another chart that shows they're producing about 2.1 billion gallons of corn ethanol. That's where they're kind of expected to be at for 2024. And with all these plants that come online, they should be easily over 4 billion gallons by the year 2032. Now, maybe not all these plants are going to get built. It's easy to announce a plant. It's something else to actually get it built. I noted in the CommStock report that in the heat of all the euphoria of building CommStock or corn ethanol plants back in the early 2000s, there were something like over 600 plants that were announced. And then I think they ended up building maybe a third of those. And so, but still the point is that it's something that's growing. It's really going to change the landscape of the market. When you have more end users and buyers come along, I think it kind of promotes planting more corn. Now, maybe the good news is this isn't necessarily a bad thing for U.S. corn producers, because if they're consuming more corn domestically, well, then they're exporting less corn, right? And so they were, just from this growth from 2 to 4 billion gallons, they were arguing that they were going to consume or process another 500 million bushels of corn domestically in Brazil in this period of time. And so it's quite a bit off from what we produce here in the United States. I think we're, our total ethanol for fuel production is like 18 billion gallons, and so if they're at 2 right now and they get to 4 billion in the next several years, it's still a far cry. But the point is that it's growing. They're expecting steady growth, and they kind of have the wind at their back. And I don't know why this trend will change. It's certainly going up, whereas in the United States, it's been pretty stagnant for some time now.
Has U.S. ethanol production kind of reached a plateau, though, or are we still expanding?
In my opinion, we've kind of reached a plateau. It can go up or down, mostly depending on what the price of corn is doing. Obviously, if there's cheaper corn, they can their financial returns are generally a little bit better, and they can afford to process more. But long term, unless we get something going with the carbon pipelines or the sustainable aviation fuel, I don't see a lot of growth coming there. And so I think that's where our next growth markets are, from those industries, and why I think it's important for us to be able to take that next step.
Well, of course, a big growing concern that people have is how the U.S. and its trade with China is going to be comparing with China trade with Brazil. And it seems like Brazil is kind of having our lunch here lately. They have really been gaining on the U.S. Is that true or not?
Yeah, I mean it's there's been a slow and steady shift from China, for example, is the biggest buyer out there, shifting from the United States to Brazil. That's been going on for quite a while now. It's kind of got accelerated, I feel like, since 2016, since Trump's first administration, and it's no secret that the trade wars, I think, kind of sped that up a little bit, where with the tariffs, China just looked for other alternatives. And, of course, that's the big talk now and what people are concerned about. And we've been seeing lots of reports about how President Lula of Brazil has been cozying up to China. And that isn't really anything new. Obviously, Brazil is going to do what's best for Brazil, and they're a commodity export driven country, right? And China needs those imports, and they need the food products, and they've been making all sorts of announcements, from buying more Brazilian corn, sorghum, beef, even coffee from Brazil. And so I don't know exactly where the concern, of course, is I don't know where that's going to leave U.S. ag exports. Probably not in a very good place. And if we continue to ratchet up our our tariffs on China, which this week Trump announced that he was going to increase the tariffs on China another 10%. At one point he talked about increasing them up to 60%. And if you do that, it's just not going to be economically viable, I think, for China to trade with the U.S. anymore. Not just in soybeans, probably in anything. And so it's got to the point now where Brazil has expanded their production, where they could, I think, meet all of Brazil's Brazil could meet all of China's demand needs for soybeans anyway. That's kind of the number one thing. And so they're already, I think, probably buying 60% of their beans, their exportable beans from Brazil, and they could certainly buy more as time goes on. And so that's kind of where I see this heading is, if we continue to ramp these tariffs up, China might not buy anything from us anymore. And, I've said maybe that doesn't have to be a bad thing if we can develop our own domestic markets so that we aren't relied anymore on China as an export partner. But I'd like to have those in place before we, start this fight again with China. So that's my concern.
Isn't it true that China has kind of taken a long-term approach to this deal? They've invested heavily in Brazilian infrastructure, right, to help get the crops to the port, even expanding the ports themselves, right?
Yeah, I think they have. They've made a lot of investments, especially with grain storage. I mean, their state-run trading companies, COFCO. You drive through central Mato Grosso, you see grain storage with Chinese symbols on them, and they basically set up their own operations within the country to kind of source the grain directly and have it shipped right back to China. And so they have a pretty strong presence in Brazil. They don't really hide it, but Brazil wants more of it. They want to develop more ports, and probably one of the biggest things they're talking about is developing a major corridor that runs through kind of the center west region of Brazil and goes across Peru over to a port there on the Pacific Ocean. And it would be a huge undertaking. But if they could get that done, they were estimating that it would cut down shipping time from Brazil to China by 12 days. They could bypass the Panama Canal altogether, because otherwise they got to go on the Atlantic through the Panama Canal or down through the southern tip of South America. And they were estimating it could increase, just that project could increase Brazil's GDP by 1%, which could be like $22 billion, something like that. And so, they're we'll see if they can actually get that done. If it does happen, it'll take years, but these are massive projects that they're talking about doing, as they become more aligned. And once those get done, I mean, that isn't something that's going to come back. 20 years from now, the next president says, hey, no, let's get this China business back. I mean, that's going to be pretty tough to do because they've set up all the infrastructure, and basically so it can go to China.
Well, give us an idea. I know there is a wide growing season window in Brazil for beans and corn, but give us an idea when some of the first crops will be hitting the market on either of those crops right now. I would imagine that would probably be furthest in the north. Is that right?
Yeah, there's parts in Paraná that plant really early, but most of that would be in parts of Mato Grosso. Historically, I mean, you could find some of the earlier planted fields harvested by Christmas already. Now, since they started, a week or two later, maybe you're probably talking more early January, but probably late January before the bulk of the harvest really starts to begin. But I think, when I was there last year, I mean, there was already, second crop corn that was almost ankle high in mid-January. And so it had to have been planted, by the new year. And so I think they're a little bit behind this year. But yeah, you're mostly looking at a January for early harvest.
So that kind of tells me that our export window to China is going to be closing pretty quickly here.
Yeah, that's right. And that's pretty normal. I mean, there's a seasonal, you'll see where their exports kind of, begin to ratchet up here starting in February. And they peak around April, May. I mean, it takes a while for the bulk of the harvest to get going and then kind of flow through the logistical system, get to the ports. And so April, May is really the peak. And then there's kind of a long tail. But yeah, you're right. Once we get to this, early in the year, you tend to see a lot of reports, either China canceling purchases from the United States and just kind of waiting it out to get to the next Brazilian crop. And so that's pretty normal.
And the problem I see with that, Matthew, is usually after the first of the year, that's when you see a flush of grain heading to town after you start a new tax year, deferred deliveries and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That could kind of complicate things, couldn't it, for the U.S. market here?
I agree. Yeah, you see that. But I think that's a seasonal tendency that's going to continue. We might get a little bit of a rally here depending on weather in December, January, but as long as we get closer here to late January or February and Brazil's crop is looking like that 170 million metric tons, I just think there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure capping any rallies in the soybean market.
Wow. Well, from what I understand, you'll be able to do some reporting directly from Brazil here in the near future. So you'll spend a little time down there. Is that going to be possible to talk with you down there?
It should be, as long as the Wi-Fi is decent enough. So that's the only limitation.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. That would be awesome to get a boots on the ground perspective there, direct from where it's happening. Not too many folks can say they can do that, but we can right here. So looking forward to that. And in the meantime, I guess I'll let you go for now. I hope you have a good Thanksgiving. Best wishes to you and the family. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk with you here again before too long. Maybe you'll be in Brazil, maybe not quite yet, but we'll see. Look forward to that. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. And Matthew, thanks again for all the content. Great stuff. Matthew Kruse, president of CommStock, with us. That'll do it for this episode. For Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlin Bohling. We'll catch you next time right here on the CommStock channel. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.